Three major legal battles are shaping the week in Washington, D.C. The president has issued a sweeping pardon of anyone tied to efforts to overturn the 2020 election, raising big constitutional questions. At the same time, the administration is defending a string of military strikes on suspected drug smugglers, and the Supreme Court is taking up a case that could reshape how states count mail-in ballots. To help sort out all the legal stakes, we're joined now by Erin Carr, an assistant law professor at Seattle U. All right, Erin, let's start with the pardon. How much power, I should say, does the president have, and are there any real limits at this point?
Well, although our government is premised on a system of checks and balances, the president's pardon powers are extremely broad. There are actually very few limits on the president's pardon powers, and in fact, they've been treated as nearly absolute, in part because the traditional view has been that there would be political consequences for a president who abused their pardon powers. So the most significant limitation is that presidential pardons are limited to federal crimes. And additionally, arguably, the president cannot use their pardon powers to pardon themselves or to pardon someone for a future crime. But those limitations largely haven't been tested.
So since presidential pardons don't apply to state crimes, what kind might individuals involved in the 2020 election interference still face at the state level?
So because the president's pardon powers are limited to federal offenses and they don't extend to state level crimes or civil matters, a presidential pardon shouldn't affect state prosecution of individuals alleged to have been involved in the 2020 election interference. In Nevada, for example, their state Supreme Court unanimously allowed the prosecution of several allies of the president who recently received pardons to proceed under state law. And so that remains a possibility.
Let's move on to the deadly airstrikes. We're just learning about another one that happened today. So can the U.S. really justify killing suspected smugglers overseas without due process?
The administration certainly has argued that it can kill accused drug smugglers unilaterally, but that position is in conflict with international and domestic law. The whole notion of due process is premised on the idea that no person is above the law and that no single person is empowered to declare what the law is and how it should be applied. And yet, amid these expanding military strikes, there has been no due process afforded.
So let's talk about international law, because that comes into play here, especially when these strikes are happening in foreign waters or near other countries' borders, right?
Mm-hmm.
So can we talk about how that impacts that?
Yeah, excellent question. And, since these military strikes started several months ago, there has been a pretty strong and consistent consensus that these strikes are not only unlawful under domestic law, but also unlawful under international law. Military leaders and legal experts alike agree that these strikes violate international laws, treaties, and norms that prohibit using military force to target civilians, and that, moreover, accused drug smugglers don't meet the legal standard of an armed group at war with the United States that could necessarily justify this kind of military action and extrajudicial killing.
So let's talk about voting rights lastly. The Supreme Court is taking up an issue that could really change how states like Washington, which is a mail-in voting state, how that could impact when the ballots come in and which ones are counted. Could this decision override state laws that are meant to protect the mail-in voters who send their ballots in on time?
Yes, so this case potentially has implications for other states that have laws that are similar to the one that is being challenged here. So earlier this week, the Supreme Court agreed to hear a challenge to a Mississippi law that could fundamentally alter mail-in ballot rules in dozens of states across the country, including potentially here in Washington state. Mississippi is one of several states that counts ballots that are mailed before Election Day, but that arrive shortly afterwards. And here the Republican National Committee has brought this lawsuit, and they're essentially arguing that the Mississippi law is in conflict with a federal law from the 1800s, and that because of this federal law, ballots that are not received by Election Day must be tossed out. The legal issue in this case is very technical, and it hinges on what is the definition of Election Day, and specifically whether Election Day is the day that voters cast their ballots rather than the day that election officials receive those ballots. If the Supreme Court sides with the RNC and adopts a narrow definition of Election Day, it would likely conclude that federal law prohibits states from counting mail-in ballots that are postmarked by Election Day but arrive after Election Day. The effects of that decision would not be limited to Mississippi.
Interesting, and that could definitely change the way we vote here in Washington. Erin Carr, assistant law professor at Seattle U, thanks so much for your time tonight.
Thank you. Have a great evening.